A puzzle. Solving a murder mystery is like solving a puzzle. So when the skeleton remains of a woman were found in 1996 in Polk County, that's what authorities were left with. A puzzle. Puzzle with missing pieces. Despite their efforts, Jane Doe's identity and killer were unknown. It took 25 years for those pieces to come together. Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel where we talk about real crimes and real people. This is The Unraveling, the mystery of Jane Doe's identity. Want to know how they found her identity? Let's get started. On September 1st, 1996, skeleton remains were found wrapped in a tarp and bound with rope on the hills overlooking the Mill Creek area in rural Polk County in Oregon. Along with the remains, the police found male clothing items, a shirt, pants, and underwear stained with semen inside a bag. These items most likely belonged to the killer, not a very smart one. He left his DNA behind, voluntarily. So what would you do if you found skeleton remains? And what would I do? First, I don't know how I would react. Most likely, I would be shocked. But hopefully, my brain and my body would function rationally. Assuming it's skeleton remains, like in this case, this is how I would like to react. Call the police and don't touch anything. Don't disturb the scene because of possible evidence. How about you? Now back to this case. The police was unable to identify the victim. The only thing known about the victim was female, in her 40s, she had given birth, and it was homicide. So the quest to identify the victim and her killer began. But for now, she was Jane Doe. Despite having the victim's DNA and the alleged killer's DNA, the police didn't get any answers. Over the years, authorities did the best they could to find out Jane Doe's identity. They used sketches, CT scans, 3D rendering images, and they also used a real skull to create a sculpture, but still no answers. Whoever this person was, nobody was looking for her, and the case was cold. In October 2019, a new detective took over the case, and he spoke about it to the Salem Reporter. Maybe after all these years, someone would recognize Jane Doe. Maybe reviving the story would bring answers. The state's forensic anthropologist told the detectives someone had gotten in touch and wanted to take a look into the case. That person was Yolanda McCleary. Yolanda was a former Las Vegas crime scene investigator, and the detective recognized her name. Number one, she was the inspiration for the character Catherine Willows on CSI. Number two, she was on a show called Justice. I've seen it, loved it, love Yolanda. So what was Yolanda up to and why did she want to look into the case? Yolanda was working on a new show to provide financial help to police agencies in identifying remains found in old cases. The network would provide the funds for all the DNA work and the genealogical researchers. The project was the Jane Doe Murders. Why do we like genetic genealogists? Remember the Golden State Killer? He got caught by using genetic genealogy. And genetic genealogy is like a puzzle, the good kind. It can give answers people are desperate to find, but it's expensive. And for 10 months, the Jane Doe Project and authorities worked together until they found answers which connected Jane Doe to a long-lost sister and her relatives. Genealogists gave Detective Williams information so he could track down Jane Doe's family and relatives. Slowly, they learned the identity of Jane Doe. Her name was Kathy Thomas. But what was her story? And how did she end up wrapped in a tarp? By talking to her long-lost sister and her stepbrother. This is what authorities learned. And could that information lead to her killer? Kathy Jean Thomas was born on December 13, 1953 in Oklahoma. Kathy's life from a very young age was just simply tragic, and the details of it makes you wonder, how can someone have such history? Was it written in the stars? Kathy was neglected, deprived, she made mistakes, and she was murdered. Kathy's parents were Leo and Jessie Thomas. Kathy had two sisters, Linda and Sandra. At the age of 5, Kathy's parents divorced. Sandra and Linda were abandoned by her parents. Both of them were adopted. But Kathy was taken to Oregon by her father and was left to a woman named Eileen Buxton. In a way to convince Leo to let her adopt Kathy and not take her away, Eileen gave him money. Yes, Kathy was bought. Reality is, if you purchase a human being, it's human trafficking, regardless of your good intentions. But Eileen wanted to give Kathy a home, a loving and stable home, and Leo just simply didn't care. Kathy was a means to an end, money. So despite this being what really is, we're going to turn a blind eye because Eileen was the best thing that happened to Kathy in her short life after she was adopted, and Leo left her life for good. At the Buxtons, Kathy had a brother who was also adopted. Kathy and her sisters never saw each other again. The future seemed hopeful for Kathy, but her world was shattered when Eileen became sick. She had cancer. At the age of 16, Kathy met a boy named Carl Tracy. Kathy became pregnant, so the two decided to get married. They had a baby girl named Tina, but Carl and Kathy divorced, and to make things worse, Eileen died. So Kathy went off the rails. Not shortly after, Kathy married again, this time James Gardner. The two had 2 children, James and Candace. But like her first marriage, Kathy and James divorced, and Kathy returned to Oklahoma. Despite being adopted at a young age, there was something Kathy had in common with her birth parents: bad parenting. She often left her children alone, so she ended up losing custody of them, and like herself, her children were all adopted. After her children were taken away, she moved to Portland, where she met a man named Brian Cliffton in 1984. Despite not being in touch with her family, Kathy's uncle knew some details about her. He learned Kathy had married a man who had been previously convicted of murder. His name, Brian Cliffton. In 1996, Kathy contacted the Salem police to report a hit-and-run crash. 6 months later, her remains were found near the Mill Creek area in Polk County. The puzzle of Kathy's life leading up to her demise was coming together piece by piece, and Brian Clifton was a new piece. Could he lead authorities closer to the truth and to what happened to Kathy? In December 1973, Multnomah County, Brian Clifton strangled a female hotel employee to death with an electrical cord of a vacuum cleaner because she allegedly had stolen from him $65. He was convicted. After being released on parole, Brian met Kathy and the two got married. The two of them lived in Salem. In 1996, a month after Kathy's remains were found, Brian married another woman and moved to another state. 9 months later, they had a child. In 2003, records showed Brian had bought a house with his new wife. The pair stayed married for 12 years. After separating, he met a guy at a homeless shelter in New Hampshire, and when they left the shelter, the two of them decided to move to Oklahoma. And that's where he started dating another woman. Brian worked at Goodwill and also had other temporary jobs, but mostly he lived off disability benefits in Oklahoma. In 2016, Brian Clifton was arrested for traffic violations. All this information authorities and the Jane Doe Project gathered was very important. If Brian had married a month later Kathy's remains were found, maybe they were divorce records. But this is what they found. Brian and Kathy didn't divorce. Brian never reported Kathy missing. A light at the end of the tunnel lit up. This was suspicious, and maybe Brian could actually be responsible for Kathy's death, and he killed her to be with the woman he married. Authorities had the clothing items found at the scene where Kathy's remains were found. It had DNA, so the police contacted Brian's sister Brenda, and Brenda wasn't a fan of Brian. She actually believed Brian most likely had killed Kathy. She provided a DNA sample, and the sample showed a 99% sibling match to the DNA found on the clothes from the scene. The shirt found at the scene also matched to a shirt Brian was wearing in an old photo. Brian Clifton was tracked down and interviewed. several times. He was very talkative, but when the subject was Kathy, he was quite reserved about it. But in August 2021, a Polk grand jury indicted Brian Clifton on the first-degree murder charges, and he was arrested. He eventually changed his plea to guilty, and he confessed being involved in the murder of Kathy Thomas. While being interviewed, he stated he had prepared to kill her. He got a good knife, he put it in his bedside table. He lay beside her for several hours, and while Kathy was asleep, he put the knife into the back of her neck the first time. Brian Clifton was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. During the process of finding the identity of Kathy Thomas and finally who killed her, Kathy's two daughters met with one of Kathy's sisters. Neither knew Kathy had passed away in 1996, so in a way, the pain Kathy inflicted in her children never had closure, which caused more pain to them. And that's the impression I had, at least with one of the children, one of the girls. But still, they fought for justice for a woman who abandoned them. Kathy Thomas was 43 years old.